Like many of us growing up on Cape Cod, I heard about houses being torn down. But were any of us ever paying attention? Did we really care about the wood these historic houses were made of?
There's a kinship between myself and wood. The feel of it, it's the feel of wood, especially antique wood. I love it. I love a piece of hand-hewed timber. I like looking at the joinery, Again, it tells a story, It just tells a story.
So one of the things we're losing with historic buildings, essentially when they end up in dumpsters, is irreplaceable wood. These woods are far superior to anything we can purchase today, other than some of the tropical woods. For years we used reclaimed wood. That's getting harder and harder to find.
Life rings, it's, a tree when you cut into it and there's rings. And that's the tree's life, that's like their bloodline. It's just, you can see them aging, and we're the same way. We're all aging, and we all have our own little wrinkles and our own patina and our own wood grains.
The tightly encircled rings in this old-growth wood made for solid results, protection from outdoor elements as well as indoor comfort. It gave them life.
And that old-growth, tight-grained lumber is so much more durable than anything today. And today we grow trees, and you might have 4 or 6 growth rings per inch. And I call it trees grown on steroids. It just doesn't have the durability of old-growth lumber. So there's the durability factor, and then there's the charm when the wood is cut and the grain shows, etc. When you've got exposed grain or exposed woodwork, you get a richer feeling from that old-growth woodwork.
This farm that I live in here was built by my family in the 1770s, and it's still here, and it's in great shape. I don't think we're going to see grandmother's home in the future. Grandmother's home is, even if it's incredibly well maintained, it's basically plywood and 2x4s. Not nearly the capable strength that a timber frame building has.
Old growth wood and older wood is far superior product. It's very seldom that there's less and less species available that in construction trade in this area anyways, that hasn't become less quality. Red cedar shingles is a great example that we use on the roofs frequently. When I was out of high school, first starting out, you could visually see the difference. There's nice, tight, parallel grain, shingles laid flat. Today, you can throw a cap between the grain lines. The grain line is spread out much more, and they don't stand up as well. They curl and cup. It's just not as good a product anymore.
When I go into an old house, I wished I could see the beginnings of how it was built. I am drawn to the curiosity of who might have lived here and who built it and who designed it, because it's not a cookie cutter. People create their own structures.
The unevenness of wood, the irregularities, the grain, your sense of touch has something like 6 different dimensions. Pressure, temperature, texture, all this kind of stuff. It's like these are all part of what we take in unconsciously. So that's kind of a richness that we deny ourselves.
Sitting near a crackling wood fire in Wellfleet's historic hatch house, Bill Burke describes the Cape's deep connection with wood, going back to when the early settlers first landed here.
Native Americans would have used the saplings, the smaller trees, to bend into weetus and shelters. And then later, European colonists would have harvested some of the bigger trees for cedar shingles to side their houses, roof their houses, fence posts. It's very weather-resistant wood. The early European settlers found a lot of hardwood trees on Cape Cod. Hickory, ash, walnut, oak. So there was good material to build houses, small boats, build fences. So the early settlers got the choice hardwoods.
Think about the fact that people came here and they needed wood to build their structure, their shelters. They needed wood to provide fuel to keep them warm. They needed wood to build their fences and other structures that related to the industries they were pursuing, and certainly their ships.
By the middle of the 19th century, hardwood forest had disappeared on Cape Cod, leaving a barren landscape few of us would recognize now.
Quite a few parts of the Cape were completely deforested, and most of the early photos that exist from the 1850s on are just open landscape of Cape Cod. You can see, Thoreau talks about this quite a bit, so you can see an open landscape from ocean to bay, for example, in Eastham.
The old-growth trees are gone forever, but old-growth wood remains in historic homes across the Cape, and that old wood is still better than anything available now.
And some of the wood that you could get back then, there's no comparable quality today. A bunch of the older wood with such tight grain, old growth, you could get huge timbers that you can't even possibly think about today.
I mean, a lot of the new wood that we do today, we made into chipboard and plastic, and we stick it together, and we make particle board and other things out of it because it's not useful for decorative display. If you look at all the modern houses that are built today, all the woodwork's painted. It's all white because they don't want to expose you to the real wood anymore because there just isn't that much good stuff around.
This is a piece of door casing, which from the front looks perfectly nice and fine. Turn it around, and it's actually 20 pieces of different wood glued together, worm damage and all, brand new. Once this is exposed to the elements outside, I give it 5 to 7 years at the very most, and that's if you keep paint on it.
So the old houses on Cape Cod hold all those original hardwoods, and that wood holds up. Ask any builder, that wood holds up better. It's a denser grained wood. So any of the old houses here are treasures because of the quality of wood and the hand craftsmanship that was put into making those houses instead of just dimensional stick lumber that came from off Cape.
Repairing, reclaiming, or reusing old wood is far better than buying new wood.
My husband and I don't see ourselves as owners of the house, rather caretakers of a historic house, which is we're people who want to keep the house in as much of its original historic condition as possible. So when we do repairs, we try to use the same type of wood.
You can absolutely save and restore an old home using parts from the existing structure and salvaging parts from other homes, which is exactly what's happening with this 18th century house in Sandwich.
This is the best wood we have right here. This is the most amazing one right here. It's the largest board that we found in the house. And how wide is it? It's 30 inches wide.
Well, it's durable. A lot of it's old growth, so the rings are close together. It's resistant to bugs. It's more resistant to rot. An example over here on this beam, these beams were from another house, but these beams were rafter beams originally. They're hewn on one side, and they were literally just a piece of tree that somebody, flattened on one side, and that's where the roof would have been. We use them here as these ceiling joists. You can see all these little like worm marks in the actual beam. The worms got in under the bark, but not into the wood because the wood is pretty solid.
Well, the house will have so many stories, right? If all this wood could talk, what would it say, right?
Yeah, thanks for saving me from the dumpster. A lot of old houses that get torn down, or rarely are they salvaged, which is a shame.
Across the Cape and Islands, scores of historic homes are still standing because they were lifted and moved, some of them many miles. For his Cape Cod home, world-renowned architect John Waterbury could have designed anything he wanted. Instead, he found what he was looking for in Connecticut, a rundown 1740 structure that he saved, by taking it apart piece by piece and moving it to Wellfleet and putting it all back together. His son tells the story.
Well, I think you do have a sense of history, and I come from a family of architects who've always appreciated. My grandfather was a student at the Beaux-Arts in Paris in the turn of the century in 1905. My father was at the American Academy in Rome, and they just loved old architecture.
Walking through the house, it feels 100% original, but it's not. Although much of it was preserved, concessions had to be made.
Well, certainly parts of it survived since 1740. There was a lot of it that wasn't recoverable. What this house is a 1740 house with modern insulation, modern electrical service, modern plumbing, air conditioning, and a modern foundation. So you're living in a 1740 house with all the modern amenities.
I think it's critical to convincing people, and maybe convincing isn't the word, to letting people see how you can adapt an 18th century house with all the character that you see here, things that even if you reproduced it won't have the same feel, and live in them in a modern way, in a way that is totally fitting with the way we live today, not sacrificing anything to have but a home with that there's nothing else like it.
This quaint, comfortable home in Sandwich was built in 1827, and much of the original wood floors, door trim, cabinets, and mantels are still sturdy, solid, and impressive after nearly 2 centuries.
I like that we are able to preserve this piece of the past. So often we're seeing them, be torn down. And for us to be here and to take care of it, even though it's a very humble house, it is in no way, this big grand house, but it's these little ones that are the most endangered. It's an amazing feeling because you can feel the layers of history here.
I think the most interesting thing about living in a historic house is that there were people who lived there before you, and their stories are in those walls and in that wood and in those materials. And you living there are adding on to that story or becoming part of their story and part of the story of that house. And in that way, you're becoming something bigger than just yourself. When you knock something down and you start fresh with a brand new house, it's only your story.
This house in Truro was built in 1790. It's largely original, with much of the old wood and surrounding structure intact. It takes a very special owner to want to preserve a house like this.
Yeah, I love the old house because it just has so much character. The wavy glass, the old creaky floors, the hinges on the doors. And I just imagine living here in the 1800s, the 1700s.
And then the other part is that as an owner, knowing that you've accepted that responsibility of being a steward.
We hear this theme repeatedly, especially from many Europeans. Europeans believe that just because you own something doesn't mean it belongs to you.
I think the soul comes from the age, from the inhabitants, from the people who have been there before you, the love, their lives, the happy times, the catastrophes, everything. I mean, this is what living is all about, and that's why we have to preserve what we have, because buildings mean so much to our people. It provides us shelter, it provides us places to gather, it provides us, it's the fabric of our lives.
Sometimes people are content starting their own story by tearing down the past. Maybe, just maybe, they would have second thoughts if they felt the pain of seeing a childhood home torn down. For one person watching the previous film in this series, it hit her hard.
And I didn't know it was going to be in the film, so when I saw Love Letters last year, that's what got me involved, because I sat there and cried. I went to see the movie. I didn't know it was going to have that in it. And boom, there's the vacant lot with the new house on it. And it was, my mother died. My father built the house every stick, so I remember every bit of it. and the discussions that went on and how we built our custom bedroom and the drawers and everything they did over a period of time. They only built the houses when they had the cash, so it was done in stages with the help of all our Nickerson relatives. And so it was my childhood and my whole life, and my mom died there. Right. But you can't take the happy memories away. My grandmother came to live with us, and she said, "This is the house that love built."
In this house from the early 1800s in East Dennis, the history was literally written in the walls.
They discovered it in one of the posts, and the box said, "Look." And it was burned on there. And then, when they opened up the box, this says, "To posterity." And then, when we opened it up, there's another letter in there. And it says, "This building was erected in September 1834 by a society in Dennis for the promotion of education and improvement of the rising generation."
The letter in the box turned out to be a time capsule, personally telling the story of the house and bringing it to life, with the master builder's name, the names of the people who helped construct the house. The letter even went on to list politicians, from local leaders all the way to Andrew Jackson in the White House. How many letters like this, or pieces of history in the walls of historic homes, have been sent to dumpsters without anyone seeing them?
Well, we lose part of ourselves, first of all. We lose our cultural memory. We lose points of reference to things that are anchored in our human experience. So it's like, kind of a mental loss, a loss of a faculty or something. It's like if you lose your hearing.
Whether you believe in it or not, countless older homes also have stories from within their walls. Those stories are stories you never hear about from a newly built home. These ghost stories help make older homes relatable to many people, giving them a human side.
I was painting the interior of a house in Chatham. The house was built in the 1770s, and I was in the house by myself, and I was on the floor in the parlor, and I had closed both of the doors because I had just scrubbed the floors and I didn't want anybody walking across them. And at the same time, both the doors opened by themselves, and I was the only one in the house. And so I just started messing around. I said, can you close that door on the left? The door on the left closed back to its original position, and the door on the right stayed open. And I said, well, while you're at it, I said, can you close that door too? Door closed, neither one of them opened back up. And I said, thank you, and I went on my way, kept painting.
The Cape has become a very attractive place to live with the shift in the world in the last couple of years, and I think things are unfortunately accelerating. I think the number of houses being destroyed is accelerating, and the houses that are replacing those old houses are larger and not as well thought out. They're quick builds because they're trying to solve a problem very quickly.
A big challenge is finding a green solution to housing. People think by tearing down an old house and replacing it with something new means increased efficiency, but the evidence doesn't support this. In fact, older is often better.
I've always found it interesting that preservation isn't thought of by most people as being a green building system, but it is.
Understanding the environmental impact of historic preservation could be the very key to engaging a younger generation to care about saving these historic homes and properties.
But when you tear down an existing building and build a new one, all of the energy that it takes to build a building goes into the upfront carbon. So even if you make a new building that doesn't need any fossil fuels to operate, you've got 2 decades of fossil fuel use tied into the construction of that building. So it's all upfront carbon. And if we're going to do anything about carbon reduction in the next 30 years, which is the targets, we've got to repurpose and reuse and retrofit every existing building we can, because tearing them down and replacing them isn't going to do it. It's basically accelerating climate change to tear buildings down and throw them away. And they came up with the time frame of how long the new building had to last before you had any net environmental benefit. And their studies range from 10 to 40 years, depending upon the building type that they looked at.
Jackson, who is an architect specializing in historic preservation and preservation technology, believes that reusing and retrofitting existing homes now is an achievable, realistic goal to help address the climate crisis, while pushing to net zero new construction essentially makes perfect the enemy of the good.
If you retrofit an old building and you get to 70 to 80% efficient compared to a new building, that's reasonable.
The environmental considerations extend beyond the carbon footprint left by new construction. There are also many concerns about the manufactured materials that go into the new house.
It's just what's happening to the industry. That's just they're using junk and gluing it all together. So because of that, a lot of people now, most builders, are using vinyl trim. And here's a piece here. It's made from vinyl chloride, one of the more dangerous chemicals on the earth, especially when it gets burnt.
Despite the strong evidence that older wood makes solid buildings, when given the choice, many people still want to tear down historic homes because they'd rather have something new and massive. With each demolition, the scale, essence, and character of Cape Cod is further compromised. The environmental costs for all of this are considerable. At this pace, the Cape will be unrecognizable in the next generation.
The loss of the Belmont Hotel, which was a beacon, was one of the first kind of resort areas on the Cape. So yeah, there's enormous loss here, and it's, it hurts you not because of the loss of a building exclusively. A loss of a building is like a loss of a limb. It's like you kind of have ghost pains. You drive by, and it's like you're missing something. You know that there's something that should have been there.
Every new demolition brings increased urgency to our efforts to save Cape Cod's historic structures. We are coming together and moving to stop the mistakes of the past. We don't have to do this alone. Experts are all over the Cape, and they want to help.
There are structural engineers that specialize in historic building systems and have them evaluate it with you, walk through it. If you rely on a kind of subdivision contractor who just typically builds new homes, I can promise you they will tell you the home can't be saved. So the big key to the process would be initially bringing in someone who understands historic buildings, whether it's someone like myself who's a preservation architect or a builder who has experience with preservation, and evaluating the house. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find you can totally renovate, restore, and adaptively reuse that house for your home.
We save everything. When we go in, if we have to open up walls, we'll take, if we got to take trim off, which I try not to do, but if we do, we salvage it. If we got to rebuild the chimney, we'll remove the mantles and salvage it. Same thing with doors.
Many of us won't be confronted with the decision to save an old house, but almost all of us have been in an older building. And historic buildings tell their own story and make their own best case for preservation. Stepping into Thatcher Hall in Yarmouthport has been a transformative and inspirational experience for many, starting with the people who were moved to save it.
The doors were open, so we came in, and we stood and looked at this building, and the first words out of each of our mouths, almost as if in unison, was, "Wow." And then right on the heels of that, both of us said, "Oh my God, it's falling down." So I got on the phone, I started to make some phone calls to some people in town who are prime movers, and we started a movement, first of all, to develop an organization, the Yarmouth New Church Preservation Foundation, to raise money to preserve this magnificent building. A preponderance of people that I've introduced to this building get it. They walk in and they get what I just referred to at the outset as the wow factor. They think, "Oh my God, this is amazing. Tell me about the building."
Old growth wood exists in many of the churches across Cape Cod, along with inns and restaurants, or cultural and community centers like Highfield Hall and Gardens in Falmouth. In a digital world where we spend a lot of time on our phones, not really paying attention to what is around us, maybe it's time to take a breath. Take a minute to look at the wood and use your imagination to consider the story that's in that wood. Who cut it? When was that wood cut? Where is it from? How old is the wood? Maybe curiosity is the key to historic preservation. If we ask more questions, we won't just consider the nostalgia of historic preservation, but the environmental and psychological consequences of tearing things down that can be saved.
Well, this place is pretty spectacular because it's got this volume to it. I mean, we're in this old coach house or carriage house with the horse stalls behind me, and but when they built this, they exposed all this wood and finished it in a natural finish, and it lasted like that for basically 100 years, and then it got repurposed into a residential environment. But it has that story that comes with us when you see it. When you look at these materials, you can tell they've been there. I just love that they have the stalls behind me and everything is still left. That doesn't happen very often. So these people really did a joyous thing when they reconverted this one and left the expression of the past.
Things can be saved no matter their age, especially these houses that were well constructed. There was pride in the construction, and they were meant to be lived in. These houses were not built with the idea that, oh, well, in 50 years they'll tear it down and build something else. This was made to last, and so it has lasted this long. There's no reason why it can't keep going.
And the push for preservation will keep going, but there is still much work to be done.